Hello and welcome to this podcast. I'm joined today by Simon Burton, and actually, I'm going to let Simon introduce himself because he's done so many things. I don't think I could do it justice. So, Simon, take a couple of minutes, let people know who you are, and then we'll come back.
Wow. What an intro. Thank you, Adam.
I know, exactly, right? Well, you know your life better than I do. I'm just making assumptions.
My name is Simon Burton, and I've launched and sold 3 trade shows and 3 awards campaigns. That's a lie. That's a total lie. I mean, my name is Simon Burton, but I've launched...
I'm glad you got that.
Yeah, one part I got that. I reckon I've launched 7 trade shows and probably the same many awards campaigns. Yes, I have sold a few, but I've also screwed many up, and I know more about the ones that screwed up and why they screwed up than I do about the ones that succeeded. I've also had an event industry PR company working both with contractors and with organisers. I was one of the founders during the pandemic of the Virtual Events Institute. I'm the kind of guy we're going to chat and we're going to say, I've got an idea, and then we're going to do the idea. And sometimes they work and sometimes they don't.
Standard. Sounds like me then, which is, I think, why we get on.
Exactly.
So look, you've teed me up nicely because one of the reasons I invited you on here is the Virtual Event Institute. And I'd been doing virtual events before the pandemic became a thing and made it a viable proposition. You shared some really interesting learnings about the Virtual Events Institute. And it'd be great if you could share that, because I feel like we need to reconnect maybe with virtual events in a different way. And that may not be as a trade show, but I think our listeners would love to hear your insights into what happened there. And like you said at the top, we learn more from getting things wrong than we do from getting things right. I certainly have.
Yeah, no, I bet we all do. So I guess the first thing to say is hindsight is a wonderful thing. And the second thing to say is that I make no judgment about myself or my colleagues from the things I learned, or indeed our industry in any kind of negative sense. So whilst these are unfiltered, they're not meant to be comments on anyone's views at the time. But as I say, hindsight's a wonderful thing. So the first thing to say is, insofar as there is such a thing as an events industry, what the Virtual Events Institute taught me is that it is creative, imaginative, and incredibly good under pressure. I don't think there's any other marketing industry or media platform that responded with the verve of the events industry. So that's point one. Second is that the Virtual Events Institute proved a point to me that I tried to articulate for a long time, which is we all want to use this word event and have ownership of, but there are many different types of live events, and they all have their different personalities and traits, and they are not as homogenous as sometimes we would like them to believe, nor are they often as unique as we would like them to believe. But there's a big question about how you define an event, and is a trade show the same as an awards show, the same as an experiential marketing campaign? And what about the Olympics? Or what about the Scout Jamboree, or whatever it might be? We sort of talk about them all as events as if they're interchangeable, and I suspect they're not. So those are kind of the big gloss things. The next thing is an entrepreneurial lesson, which is, it was raining and we were selling umbrellas, and I have never been in that position before. And it was a wonderful feeling, and it made me reflect on entrepreneurship and the nature of some entrepreneurs, and I count myself amongst them, is we're problem solvers. And that's wonderful and stimulating, but it might not be where the money is. So that's a general gloss around the nature of spotting the opportunity. But I think you and I chatted about this when we were briefing for the call. But one of my biggest takeouts, and perhaps one of the ones that we'll pull out in more detail, is when we created the content for the Virtual Events Institute, I think what we revealed were 2 things. One is that events are enormously complicated, and we tend to blur a lot of the time the lines between marketing and operational. Or there's this Venn diagram where those 2 overlap and implicate one another. And we're not always clear who's where the buck stops, who's ultimately responsible. And the second thing is that, and I've always rebelled against this, but we created a lot of content that was about the process and the project and the operation of event. I think the biggest learning for me, the most important thing, was what we should have been leaning into was the understanding of the technology and the hardware and the implications of the tech, and that's not process. We as an industry take for granted our suppliers patching our gaps of knowledge in for us. But when it came to virtual events, we really needed to understand the tech a bit better. And I think that's my biggest learning, because I think that's still true, that we need to learn how this operational tech works. And I mean operational, not MarTech.
Yeah, I did a podcast with my former colleague, Dan Loosemore, and we were talking about where we first met, which was what people would now describe as a marketing services company where we're doing lots and lots of webinars. And we learned that lesson pretty much ourselves very quickly. We learned that, number one, farming it out to someone else is not optimal, because a big part of the performance is in how people switch between speakers and create that engagement. That's one thing. But you're absolutely right. Another big part of it is learning the nuances of the tech and what works, what doesn't work. And we, for example, we got sucked into a bit of a red herring of trying to do like higher and higher fidelity video. But actually the audio is the most important thing. You know, if your video slightly blurs and so on, people will forgive you. It's when your audio sucks, you've got a problem. So we thought, hey, this is easy. Literally, we thought, this is easy. We'll just jump on a few microphones and do that. And we started seeing drop-off rates before we started understanding it. And then we realized that actually, just because one person can do it on the screen and switch it, that doesn't work. So we finally realized we need a team of 4. And that took us a year to uncover. And we also realized that, you know, you kind of have to be in tune with the production quality and the content. You have to be in what I call attention by design, not attention by default, where you've got a room full of people. Yeah. Why do you think that is, that event organizers, and I count myself in this, right? We think that the mechanics of putting it together is the important thing. And in the virtual world, it's the flip, right? Almost.
I think that's why streaming a live event is so challenging, because the two things aren't as aligned as we'd like them to be, unless you've got the production budget of a Premier League football match. In fact, many of those TV events which look live, you know, Strictly Come Dancing, for instance, that's not live. The audience in that event is constantly being compromised in order to satisfy the TV audience, and that's a hard place for us as event planners to be. So I think that's the first challenge. I think the second challenge is, because this was so new, there was no embedded knowledge or experience. So there weren't C-suite or senior people who understood quite how difficult this was. They just saw a load of people producing decent YouTube quality, you know, Joe Wicks or whoever, thinking that they should have been able to do that with their event, and their team didn't have that skill set or that knowledge. And so we were all fumbling and learning very hard on the job.
I think there's another thing of authenticity, right? You called out a YouTuber. And if you look at the ones that are successful, it's the ones that are most authentic. And in a B2B context, authenticity isn't always the default in terms of content production, right? Because it becomes, here's our message, then it goes through 3 marketing people, and then it gets sanity checked. And if the CEO is presenting, it gets triple sanity checked because it might affect stock prices and so on. And by the time it comes out, it's this hyper-polished, vanilla, boring nonsense that...
Yes, it can be very anodyne. And the risk is, if you go for authenticity, something terrible goes wrong, and that somehow feels worse for the remote audience than it does for the live audience. 9 times out of 10, that feels worse. And so we were, I don't like the word organisers, actually. Yeah, I've worked with some colleagues who really rebel against it. I'm not that bad, but I don't like it because it suggests that we're all about folders and clipboards and stuff. And even the best operational people I know aren't like that. I want us to talk about ourselves as event producers or directors. Or else director,
but you're right. It's a very different mindset. I had that epiphany when I went from being in trade shows to joining George B. Johnson, who that's what they do, right? And it was like, oh my God, really? So we can do that? Because when I think it's just a very different mindset. We're like going, hey, we're just going to orchestrate the whole thing, soup to nuts, and we're going to design the entire experience and so on and so on.
I was very lucky. I think such a valuable point you make there. And when I moved from trade shows into awards, that was my epiphany because pre-virtual pandemic thrust upon us. Awards are scripted to within an inch of their life. Of course, so you couldn't deliver that event without it being theatrical, is perhaps a bit intense, but without it being produced and managed. That was a huge learning for me. And when you take that into the virtual space, you realize that this should be true of all these things. And if you can do that and remain authentic, then you've got gold dust. One of the points in our shared career and one of the questions you flexed about, the real question for me is, how can you create that within a trade show without losing the serendipity, which is what makes trade shows amazing?
I mean, that's a really good question. And I think some of it also comes from, because a bit like you, I think deeply and perhaps sometimes too deeply and too long about my failures and what happened there, because no one sets out to fail. There's an aspiration that you had, but it doesn't quite work. And I think one of the things that I find certainly in the difference between the online world and the in-person world is in the in-person world, we are much closer to our authentic human self. Anthropologist friend of mine said to me, so listen, Adam, we've literally only just left the cave. So you stick 8, 9 people in a room, something is bound to happen, right? It'll be positive, negative, or whatever, but there will be some chemistry. You don't have to worry about it. In the online world, that is entirely different, and which is why all people like Facebook hire psychologists. How do you hack people back in? And it's much more manipulative. And I think there's something bigger going on that. But to your question about trade shows, I do believe that there is another level we can reach where we do more scripting. There is more scripting. There is more, like I was reminded about the story about your friend, and I don't know, you can talk about it, but he went on a TED talk, and the amount they drive their presenters to deliver awesome will be delivered, and it usually never is.
I spent a lot of time post attending TED as the bag carrier for a friend who was speaking at TED, thinking about the nature of presenters in our B2B conferences and exhibitions. And I've been part of our industry and watched that transition to content. Let's have lots of content. I think I was one of the early adopters of that strategy at Exhibiting Show. We were very blasé about content. It meant get someone we thought was a half-decent speaker and leave them to it. And they brought their stick along back in the day and plugged it in and off they went. And we didn't police it or challenge or really work them and us. And what watching the TED process really revealed to me is quite how drilled and mannered and controlled. And you're signing up to be part of a thing. You're committing to it. And that results in exceptionally high quality output. Now, that may be the norm now in some of those stellar events. I suspect it's true, but that sense of speaker liaison and really nurturing those people, because they're your talent, was really striking to me. And then from there, speaking to some people I know who write speeches for very, very senior CEOs, very big CEOs, and people you were just talking about, and talking about panel discussions, really, really briefing your panel moderators. But don't just get the person who you think can do it. We should really invest in these roles, making sure that person reflects our brand values. So that's the authenticity. That they understand what we want the audience to get from this session, and then really carefully selecting who's on that panel and how we manage them. And that's true whether it's a virtual event or a live event or hybrid, and whether the stream is synchronous or asynchronous.
Look, you're pulling it all back to this construct, but the narrative that we've been pulling out of it almost by default is content. And for some people, you've said it, I'll be more pointed. Content is the result of a transactive process, right? Do you want to sponsor? Do you want to speak? Yes, I do. Who have you got? Fine, you're in. And it becomes very challenging to then turn around and say, look, that person ain't quite good enough. Do you have someone else? And I'm talking in the context of B2B trade shows. And when we look at the data, our data, you can very quickly build up patterns where even the wording on the website will guide people and put people off and put people in the right place. And it becomes so nuanced. To do it well, we almost need to overstaff the content teams, and that's not always true. That doesn't always happen. It's the sales team, and then the marketing team, and then the operations team. And the science of content alongside trade shows, I feel, has been lost.
Do you think it matters? I mean, you're looking at that kind of data. If I've got a successful trade show and I'm making good margin and my exhibitors come back and my visitors come back because there's something innate about the new in that market that they need to see, and I might have content because it's part of the aesthetic of a modern trade show, but that content's somewhat compromised. Does that matter?
It's a really good question. And I've been sitting with it a lot, because you're right. People are saying, well, look, the model isn't broken, so what does it matter? And it's one of those tough things to do in a live trade show environment. You can't A/B test, right? It's ridiculously hard to do this versus that. But when you look at the engagement and the importance of, say, the agenda page as part of the registration journey, so it does matter, right? The interesting question is it a tick box exercise? Is the agenda page just a tick box exercise so you can go to your boss and say, can I have the 2 days off because I want to go there, right? Or is it something that within the participants is a continual sense of, like, you feel let down? And I'm speaking as a sample of one. I go to a lot of tech shows that aren't trade shows, but they are a bit more grungy, a bit more cutting edge. And I'm very rarely disappointed, because the person who's speaking cares so passionately about that subject. I will learn something new.
But is the commerciality of that event based on exhibition stands and visitors engaging with them?
So this is the commerciality of those events is based on everybody either gives their time for free. So that's one thing, because we're all trying to figure out something on AI, or you pay, but you don't pay 1,000 quid, you pay 50 quid, 100 quid. And they kind of, and this is where the disconnect with the trade show is clearly.
Well, I've got two disconnects, which after a 30-year career in this industry are the two disconnects that I still can't resolve. And the first is that we know that our attendees go to a trade show, whether it's a learning trade show or a transactional trade show or an inspirational. We know our attendees are there because they want to solve a problem. And yet I question if we ever know quite what that problem is. Like, do we have an aggregate bucket of problems? That doesn't feel like the kind of questions we ask. We ask how big their company is, how big their budget is, where have they come from, what. We don't ask them what their problem is. We ask them what sort of people they're looking for. So we ask them to match against the genre of exhibitor. But we don't say, tell me what your problem is. And actually, that's why people go. They've got this problem. So I mean, maybe it doesn't matter, but I often wonder, if we can untangle that knot, I'm going to trade show X because I've got a problem Y, and I believe somebody there will solve that problem. Right, you'd get better exhibitors because they'd articulate what their solution was rather than what their feature was. And you'd reduce serendipity because I'm not wasting my time trying to badly articulate my problem as I'm doing now. So that's my first conundrum. And my second conundrum is, on almost any B2B event, if you ask the audience why they were there, either number one or number two would be to network. And yet if you tried to create an event where you charged people for the networking, they would balk at paying, but they'll pay for a table and awards or stand an exhibition or to sponsor a conference. And I just can't fathom it. Like if I created this big networking event and tried to charge people to attend it, they wouldn't pay. Despite them telling me that's why they go. And so often you see it at industry conferences where once they're there, they couldn't care less about the content on the stage because the content they really care about is the other people.
I feel like it's something that I agree with you, by the way, and I still feel like it's a nut worth cracking. If you look at a lot of the networking tech, and you've called it out already, Tamar, who I did another podcast with, actually wrote a LinkedIn post about this. Like, oh my God, how long are these registration forms and why are you asking this question? So I think this question is floating around anyway. And I feel like if we look at it as an outcome-centric problem and say, we want people to genuinely network between people who've got a problem and who've got a solution, and that may be an exhibitor, it may be a sponsor, but none of the networking tech is designed behind that, because the networking tech is designed behind trying to push everybody into the right bucket so that the sponsors feel that they're getting value for money and so on, rather than, when you and I were having coffee, we started talking about this concept of flow. Trade shows flow sporadically, but there's no real flow. And well-designed systems create a flow. Say, Adam, you've got this problem. Let us flow you through it. And by the end of it, you'll have more information and you can take action and make a decision.
Well, we reconnected. We're a good case study in this. We reconnected because we were both speaking at a conference recently.
Yeah.
And you talked for 30 seconds in your presentation about something you'd done. And that's why we spoke afterwards, because it exactly addressed a problem I had, quite a profound challenge in a process I was trying to manage. The problem with getting rid of serendipity is I don't think I would ever have articulated that as a challenge until I heard you articulate the solution. So what is this way in which we can, to get flow, unlock what my real day-to-day challenges are such that they can be matched with someone who's got that solution? That's real power, right?
Yeah, and if we unpick that moment, there's kind of flow on two sides, because I got asked to do that presentation. So I was like, well, I could just stand here and show a bunch of tech, or I can show it in the context of relevant use cases for events, right? If I hadn't have done that, that moment wouldn't have happened. And that's the responsibility, I think, that ought to be engineered.
But I'm asking from the problem owner's perspective. Sometimes those challenges in a business are quite
discovery,
unspoken.
Right? Yeah.
Imagine we start doing visitor focus groups. So we don't understand that they make widgets. We understand that the challenge they have with widgets really is this bit of the process. I'm not a widget maker, so I don't know. But no one's ever said that before because it's not captured on a standard demographic form. There's this challenge, and actually we can feed that back to our exhibitors and say, if you articulated, not that you help them make widgets, but you help them speed up this bit of the process, or help them make them blue at this point, or help them make them an eighth of a millimeter bigger at this point, because that's what they all said is the problem. Then you've got real power in that trade show mix, haven't you? Matching solution and problem is much more powerful than matching some people who buy with some people who sell.
I think this is where I'm getting so excited about what generative AI can do, and chaining it using frameworks like LangChain and so on. Because what you've described is and I've worked with some brilliant conference producers, that is what they do. But scaling it up beyond, let's say, 150-person conference is tough. But with generative AI, we have an opportunity to do that.
That's why conferences are important, even if they're flawed. In a trade show, I recognize the kind of people you're talking about are superlative at their task. the great Austin Hawkins was once trying to persuade me to go to a conference I didn't want to go to. And I said, I know them all anyway, speaking to the networking piece. And he gave me the best answer anyone's ever given me. He said, but when they're at the conference, they're thinking about the very problem that you've got a solution for. And it was an absolute light bulb moment for me. Because even if the content on stage had been suboptimal, it's still going to force you to think about it and start to articulate better what your challenges are. And then you're going to talk to the person next to you and realize they can solve them. So maybe, Adam, the danger of two moderately clever chaps talking like this is that we miss the obvious, which is actually, that's one of the reasons why the content works, is because it's not designed to be perfect. Its job is to make sure we're thinking about the right things. It's to inspire us to have the right conversations with everybody. It's oil.
And Simon, I think on that note, we will leave it because we've hit our half hour. And the job of content is to inspire us to think about the right question. What a beautiful place to leave it on. Thank you so much for your time, Simon, and thank you all for listening.
Thanks for having me.